All right, Lone Star Gunners, welcome to the podcast. This is Lone Star Gun Talk, the official podcast of Lone Star Gun Rights. And I am your host, as always, Derek Wills. Welcome to the program. First, I got to get something off my chest. There have been so many people that I have seen, both that follow us and both that don't, that support some provisions of Governor Abbott's proposal. Okay, earlier this last week, Governor Abbott came out with this atrocious plan that is gun control. People have been giving us kickback because we oppose things like mandatory safe storage laws or prosecuting parents because their child gets a hold of their firearm and misuses it. I understand that we should do that. We should keep our firearms safe from our children and teach them properly firearm safety. And we should want to ensure that something like this doesn't happen as a parent. But you don't criminalize the act of something that you had nothing to do with. You don't punish the father for the sins of the child. Just like you don't punish the son for the sins of the father. Here's the thing. Two things can be true at once. Okay, we can both support and want and encourage people to keep their firearms safely stored and completely oppose making it illegal not to do so. The thing is, liberty is not granted on the basis that we make good decisions. That's not liberty. In fact, liberty, by its very definition, is the ability for us to make very bad decisions sometimes. Now, only when those decisions infringe upon the rights of another person, directly infringe upon the rights of another person, that is when criminal charges need to be filed. That is when a trial needs to happen to determine to what extent that person infringed upon the liberties of another human being. Governor Abbott also called for making it illegal to not report a stolen firearm. Okay, how many of you out there, if you found out that your guns were stolen, would not report it? You don't need to make it illegal. But what happens if you have an arsenal in your house, or let's say you don't even have an arsenal in your house? Let's say you go on a month-long vacation because you and your wife have been working hard and saving a lot of money, and you just said, you know what, we're going to take a month off and just relax. And you go on vacation. 3 days after you leave, somebody breaks into your house and steals your firearms. And then, guess what? They use it in another crime. Are you going to be held responsible for that? Because you didn't report it? Because you didn't frickin' know? The same thing here's the thing. You should want to report your stolen firearms, but you shouldn't make it illegal to not do so. That is your property. And if you don't want to report it stolen for whatever reason that you decide, that should be your prerogative. Reporting a stolen firearm is not going to help the police in any way, because I promise you, as soon as they steal your firearm, chances are they've already filed off the serial number, so they won't even know that that was your firearm that was stolen. Okay? There are so many things wrong with this, and you cannot list a defensive prosecution for every scenario where this law will be completely misused. Another huge talking point is mental health. Oh man, people love the mental health talking point, except they don't want to actually delve into it and figure out what that means. Just how much can the government infringe upon your liberties under the guise of mental health issues? We hear, oh yeah, there needs to be more things for mental health, and we shouldn't allow people with mental health problems to own a firearm. And I was asked directly during our live stream, you think somebody who's mentally unstable should have the right to keep and bear arms? I'm like, well, it's not my right to give. It's not the government's right to give. It is a right that was given to us by God. It is a right that was given to us it is inherent to us as human beings, whatever your beliefs are. No judgment here. Okay? The fact of the matter remains that whenever you start digging into mental health issues, you start realizing just how screwy of a topic this is. The thing is, overall, mental health, that sounds like a great talking point. Sounds powerful. It's broad. It hammers things home. It's mental health. Until you start realizing that a vet with PTSD is mental health. A mother who's going through postpartum depression, which is a regular occurrence, by the way, is mental health. Or whenever somebody is grieving the death of a loved one, or even the breakup of a wife or girlfriend or boyfriend or husband, or what have you. Traumatic things happen in our lives that we all deal with. Guess what? When you are depressed, that is mental health. And that's what we're going to talk about today. To help us out, we have a special guest who is a mental health professional. His name is Lee Spiller, and he is the executive director of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, Texas. Lee, welcome to Lone Star Gun Talk, sir.
Hey, thank you, thank you. Yeah, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm a human rights activist. I'm the executive director of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights of Texas. And we serve as a mental health watchdog group whose purpose is to restore basic inalienable rights to the field of mental health. So for the past 21 years, I've worked on fraud cases, restraint deaths, cases where people are being locked up against their will for no good reason, um, those types of issues, drugging in foster care. We're not a gun rights group, but that said, there's some overlap between us and Second Amendment groups because allegations of mental illness can so deeply impact your rights and your liberties. So, it pays to have some understanding of the mental health world.
For sure. Right before I brought you on, I was talking about how nobody wants to actually delve into this issue. It's a great talking point whenever it comes to gun rights. Oh yeah, we should not want people who are mentally ill to have a gun because they're mentally ill, so they might do something. But the problem is, as soon as you start delving into the actual issue and defining what constitutes mental health, you realize just how broad of a topic this is. And
Yes,
yeah, go ahead.
yes. Yeah, as a rights organization, we're really disturbed by this narrative around violence and people with mental health labels because it's important to remember that the mental health population is mainly individuals who are presumed to be competent and who haven't committed a crime. But in this dialogue, we treat them differently. One of the most disturbing things, and so many people fall into it. One minute you're talking about guns in the hands of violent felons. The next minute you're talking about guns in the hands of quote unquote mentally ill people. And then you play the narrative back, and the way we're describing these two populations is identical, and that's wrong. I like to think of Dr. Rick Halpern. He's the director of the Embry Human Rights Program at SMU. And he has this great slogan. And the slogan is there's no such thing as a lesser person.
That is very
And
true.
yeah, it's one of those things you've got to keep in mind in the debate because the truth is we're talking mostly about people who have committed no crime.
Correct. And just for the record, if this is your first time listening to this podcast, one of the things that we firmly believe at Lone Star Gun Rights is that our rights are inalienable and they come to us from beyond government. And so, therefore, government doesn't have the authority to define who can and cannot exercise that right. And that also includes felons. Our philosophy is if somebody is too dangerous based off of the crime that they've committed to be released back into society, then they shouldn't be released back into society. But the same can also go for mental health. If somebody is too dangerous because of their mental illness to function in society, then they shouldn't be in society. They should be institutionalized. But again, that's also kind of a slippery slope because, well, how do you prove somebody's too dangerous if they haven't committed a crime?
Yeah, so let's break this down. First, let's look at what mental illness is. Okay, it's a lot simpler if you think of it as a social construct, right? People have problems, legitimate problems. People have behaviors, and we don't understand them. We don't know what to call them. So we come up with this term called mental illness. Right. To this day, the mental illnesses are not diagnosed with blood tests, brain scans, lab tests of any kind, X-ray. All they are is clusters of behavior, right? So there are groups, there are panels of psychiatrists that sit down and they look at clusters of behavior and they come up with names for them. And you end up with this whole big book full of quote unquote mental illnesses. Every one of them was voted into existence by a panel of psychiatrists. And one thing that's frightening about that is how many of them have ties to the drug industry. Um, so you have somebody who has real problems; they have legitimate problems. Let's take a veteran. You could say, yes, Joe just got back from Iraq. Oh man, he has really experienced. He's had some horrific experience. He's been in an extraordinary situation. He's having a normal reaction to the horrors of combat. Joe needs our support. And Joe does need our support. The problem is to bill for that, you got to give him a label,
which would
right?
be post traumatic stress.
Right. And it's funny, there's a psychologist out of San Diego who his career was working with combat stress. And I listened to him talk one time, and he had this really profound thing he said, it's post traumatic stress. It's not post traumatic stress disorder until you freeze it in place with bad treatment. So we're talking about an ordinary reaction to an extraordinary situation, and unfortunately, there are people that suffer for years.
Right. And, as far as veterans are concerned, me being a vet myself, I have seen and I know people who have PTS, and they're treated uh, with just uh, narcotic drugs to help alleviate the pain, but it doesn't actually treat the issue. And the end result is they're not actually getting treatment for what the real problem is. And the only organization that I know of specifically for that is the PTSD Foundation of America, where they have combat vets who have gone through the same thing, counseling combat vets who are still going through it. And that's really
Right.
the only way for that particular instance that you can actually treat people with that. But that's not what's being done at the VA. And even if somebody is not a combat vet, say somebody, was kidnapped and underwent a horrific ordeal, they're going to still have the same stressors that combat vets do to an extent. And it would be classified as post traumatic stress as well. So,
Correct. And yeah, and it's it's shameful. I mean, we throw buckets of drugs at people, and horrible side effects. Some of the side effects can actually be dangerous. Some of the side effects are associated with violence, and you have people struggling with that every day. Your last podcast, I was really struck. One of the commenters was talking about how he had PTSD, but he'd been proven to be, not a danger to himself or others, that type of thing. And I replied back, and my reply was, dude, you don't have to prove anything. You are presumed to be competent, and you are presumed not to be a danger to self or others. But I think that illustrates the danger of these labels, because once we give somebody a label, people want to second guess them. They want to substitute their judgment, and it's really uncalled for. I look at it and I go, okay, let's look at the forms you fill out when you buy a gun. What are they asking? They're asking if you're mentally defective.
and,
You're familiar with that question?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And most of that, at least per federal law and even state law, they're asking if you've been ruled by a judge as being mentally incompetent. Well, the problem with that
Right.
is how can a judge make that determination? A judge is not a
Correct.
mental health doctor. He,
Well, he relies on mental health doctors. The real question is, how can a mental health doctor reliably make that decision because again, he's relying on clusters of behavior and his opinion about them. And one of the really sad things, I had a case recently where he was actually a law enforcement officer at the time, but he got detained on a mental health detention. And his comment was, once the allegation is raised, nobody listens to you anymore. All they listen to is collateral information,
Right.
right? So you're so stigmatized that nobody is listening to you. And I've been to a number of commitment hearings, and I'm always shocked and disappointed. And some of the hearings I've been to involve probably one of the better probate judges in the state, and even in his court, I'm just shocked and appalled, right? Because we're talking about judging or second guessing people's behavior. Occasionally they have done something dangerous, but even then you get into this question of, yeah, okay, so they were drunk or they were under stress. They're not now. They've sobered up. Why are you keeping them?
Right. Now you brought
Um,
up something. You actually finished my sentence for me. You you said that the judges are relying on the testimony of mental health professionals, and
mhm,
then you made a great point in that they're basing their testimony off of a cluster of behaviors. The
mhm.
issue is though that somebody can go to 10 different psychiatrists and get 10 different diagnoses, including one where they have a clean bill of health, right?
Yes. Yeah, and another interesting facet of this, for some reason we have this uptick in Texas of people walking into psych hospitals and getting held against their will. I mean, I'm talking about even people that walked in to inquire about outpatient grief counseling, calling us or calling the media and alleging, "Hey, I went in to inquire about outpatient counseling and they locked the door behind me and they wouldn't let me go." Um, the same doctor that's filling out the affidavit to have you detained or committed is often the same doctor who stands to profit from your treatment.
So there's an incentive there to have somebody who's requesting an outpatient treatment to become an inpatient patient.
You have, essentially, you have you have this inherent conflict, and I would hope that decent people would recognize it and really be careful. But it's only as good as it's kind of like the whole chain is only as good as its weakest link thing. It's something that could be abused, and in some cases, I believe it has been abused.
So as it relates to our Second Amendment rights, and we believe that that Second Amendment rights are civil rights. I said before they don't come from government to begin with.
Hmm.
So as it relates to all of these sorts of things, what sorts of impacts can, um, say, somebody walking into a clinic for outpatient treatment on depression and then they get the door locked behind them? What sort of impact can that have on them?
Well, let's look at this in two veins. Number one, once you've been locked up, there is a chance that somebody is going to file an application to have you involuntarily committed. If you get involuntarily committed, then you fall into that. God, I hate the term, that mentally defective category. Think about that for a second. If you had terminal cancer, would anybody call you defective?
I would hope not.
If you had a congenital heart defect, would anybody call you defective?
I would hope not.
Of course not. But you get a mental health label, and suddenly people feel okay calling you defective.
Well, yeah,
That's
because
it's just
you're crazy, right? That's the deal. There's such a
it's
stigma.
unjust. Let's look at this for a second, and this is part of the equation too. So you get the quote unquote mentally ill guy being portrayed as that crazy guy, the shooter.
Hmm.
Well, our prisons are full of people who had to have been crazy to do what they did. You know what? That doesn't make them mentally ill. That makes them criminals.
Right, and
Criminality doesn't make sense.
there has to be something going on in the brain to think that it's perfectly okay to take somebody's life without any sort of justification whatsoever. And I mean, if you
Right.
really get into some of these crimes, and look at the case by case instances of some of these really heinous ones. I mean, just look at Ted Bundy, for instance. I
Yep.
mean, was he mentally ill or was he just a criminal or is it both? And, whenever you talk about, say, the recent shootings, say Santa Fe, this kid's making videos and social media posts about fantasizing about doing this. But the thing is, he never saw a psychiatrist who ever asked him about any sort of violent tendencies. So he can't be labeled as mentally ill because now he's just in custody charged with crimes. And
We just don't know. We don't know his history yet. The Sutherland Springs shooter is an example because this is someone who was known to the system. He had criminal problems and he had had a mental health diagnosis and a long history of treatment. I would think that if treatment was going to work for this guy, it would have worked by then. It didn't, you
now, can,
know.
can you clarify what you mean by treatment? Does that mean drugs or does that mean counseling and psychotherapy or what have you?
All too often, in fact, I would say, kind of the mainstay of treating these labels as drugs. And I don't want to discount people out there that are trying to help people, but uh, you know, the paradigm these days is drugs, and drugs have side effects,
Mhm.
and it's actually quite interesting. CCHR International put out a paper recently on the association between psych drugs, suicide, and gun violence, and it's another one of those issues that it's tough. Researchers mined the FDA adverse event, drug event database, and they found 31 drugs that were disproportionately associated with violence.
Really?
25, yeah, 25 of them were psychiatric, and they were common psychiatric drugs, things like antidepressants, which tens of millions of Americans are on. Right? Does that mean that they shouldn't own guns? Well, you wouldn't take guns away from tens of millions of people on the basis of they take a drug,
Well, yeah, and
right?
depression is such a widespread, I guess, for lack of a better word, issue because some people are just depressed because of it might be a chemical imbalance, or some people are depressed because of, I don't know, postpartum depression, or, they just suffered the loss of a loved one or a breakup of a marriage or what have you. Depression comes
People
in.
get yeah, people can be depressed because of life situations. They can be depressed because of an underlying physical illness.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of reasons people get depressed. The interesting thing about the chemical imbalance is that that actually um, that was a theory, and it was a good theory because it sold a lot of drugs and people fall for it. But if you listen to the commercials, the one that comes to mind is the Zoloft commercial. But in general, antidepressant commercials have kind of done this. Depression may be caused by a chemical imbalance. Such and such treats that chemical imbalance by doing blah, blah, blah. But no, it doesn't say it is caused by a chemical imbalance. It says it may be caused by a chemical imbalance. And
Interesting.
there have been a number of experts that have jumped onto that because, it sounds good and it certainly sells product. But the truth is, we don't know. You can't test somebody's blood. Like let's say you put somebody on an antidepressant, you can't really test their blood to see what is a proper level of that antidepressant. You really can't test. I don't think you can test for a proper level of serotonin, and you've got a number of serotonin receptors. It gets kind of crazy, and I'm not a doctor. The doctor would probably discuss it better, but the point is, the chemical imbalance is a theory, and there's just when you look at the mental illnesses, you really what you have to go on is clusters of behavior and somebody's opinion about them. You can't verify it with an X-ray or a brain scan or anything like that.
So,
And that's so that that it, that's part of the slippery slope problem is because in essence, you're going to be judging somebody's behavior. So now you've got somebody that's been labeled. We apparently feel completely okay talking smack about them, talking about how they're dangerous, blah, 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 blah. But, it's just one of those things you have to be really careful of. Are there dangerous people? Absolutely. But to portray a whole population as dangerous or potentially dangerous is a rights nightmare.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially whenever you start getting into some of the more, I guess, serious cases of, um, well, I even like minor bipolar disorder, uh, and even major bipolar disorder. Sometimes, I mean, there's no guarantee that one, you'll get a diagnosis of that, and two, if you do get diagnosed with that, there's no guarantee that it's an accurate diagnosis. Uh, I've talked on this program a little bit about my sister who committed suicide in 1997, and I went through uh, probably about 3 years of uh, of taking antidepressants and seeing a psychiatrist on the regular to help me cope with that. Which, looking back, was probably not the best of methods. But at one point, one doctor actually diagnosed me as bipolar, and I am probably the furthest thing from an example of somebody that's bipolar that you can find. And but that was only one doctor, and I saw many. So,
Hmm.
you know, we start coming into things like that, and when people are talking about gun rights as they relate to gun rights, are we going to start having HIPAA laws violated to where whenever somebody issues uh, a diagnosis that fits whatever government criteria they set, they're reporting that now to the NICS background check system? Or, it kind of goes into this big ordeal, and the governor kind of went into this a little bit with his program to identify quote problem children, or that's not really a quote, but basically what he was saying is if there are students that have issues, allowing teachers and staff to identify those and deal with it before they may or may not get violent. And we start
Yeah,
going
and
into
how do you do that? We're into the pre-crime kind of, Minority Report. I
I,
always thought it was a decent movie. Now it seems like it's more of a manual.
I was literally going to bring up that movie. But yeah, it
Yes,
it
and I don't
actually
know if you
is.
caught it. I don't know if you caught it, but uh, yesterday evening, the Speaker of the Texas House put out a set of interim charges on this gun safety and mental health issue. And one of the things that he's wanting a couple of committees to explore is actually universal mental health screening for our kids.
Because that's not Orwellian at all.
Oh no. It's weird. I've done a lot of work on lot of different types of cases, but the first family law case I ever worked on, it was probably the second CPS case I had, but it was the first one where I was actually assisting the lawyer and stuff like that. Was a little girl in Pflugerville who her parents let her participate in a mental health screening project. It was, a little research project out of UT, and next thing you know, and they had apparently gotten a letter. Yeah, your daughter's cool. Clean bill of health, and then within a short time after that, they're getting calls from the researchers. Oh, you've got to talk to our psychiatrist. Your daughter needs to be institutionalized. Blah 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 blah. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute. We're gonna go get a second opinion. And they didn't see any suicidal behavior, so they chose to watch and wait. Which is a legitimate strategy. Um, their daughter was removed from them, and she was taken to Austin State Hospital. She was forcibly injected. She was restrained 26 times. And her attorney, a reporter, a psychologist, her doctor, and us, all of us working to try to get her home. It was over 4 months before this little girl went home.
Wow.
I mean, imagine being 13 years old. You've been stripped away from your family. You're in Austin State Hospital. and you're being physically restrained by adults and injected. I mean, we're talking about treating people like animals.
Right. Not to
And
mention, I mean, the there's so much wrong with that. I mean, the parents' rights are being violated, the girls' rights are being violated at an atrocious level. I mean, it is. I want to say it's a leftist's wet dream as far as mental health is concerned, but whenever we start talking about issues of mental health as it relates to any rights, but particularly for us, gun rights, this is the kind of stuff that we're afraid will happen, but apparently it's already happening.
it is, and it's something we have to be cognizant of. If you're talking about your right to possess, then you've got that horrible mentally defective language. And let's look at this for a second. You're talking about being civilly committed. Last year there were 49,000 applications for involuntary commitment in our state.
That's just involuntary.
That's just involuntary, and
So
that's just civil commitment. That
wow.
doesn't include criminal. That's civil. Um, 49,000 applications. Now, only a small percentage of those cases actually get held long enough to get a commitment hearing. Of those that do, about two-thirds of them did get committed. That's the end of their Second Amendment rights.
Of course.
Um, yeah, of course. And then for the rest, okay, now let's. Oh, wait. Let's stay on the commitment issue first. Okay, so that's your civil commitments. Then on the criminal side, you get arrested, even for Class B misdemeanors. Somebody can allege that you're mentally ill and incompetent to stand trial, in which case you're going to be committed.
Right. And then there go your Second Amendment rights. Not to mention the
Right.
charge of a Class B misdemeanor in the state of Texas. Uh,
It's going to interfere with your LTC rights.
exactly.
Right. So you've had a criminal charge. Somebody has decided that you may be incompetent. You're going to have a hearing on that. You don't get to stand up and request a jury trial on competency. Only your attorney, your attorney gets to stand up, not you, which
Because
is
you're
interesting.
mentally incompetent, correct?
Well, see, that's the thing. The law presumes that people are mentally competent. You're presumed competent, but somehow in this criminal system, they worked it to where no, your lawyer gets to speak up. Your lawyer can demand a jury trial on competence. Well, what if your lawyer is the one that's saying that you're incompetent?
Yeah.
And the other piece of that commitment is that it doesn't depend on dangerousness. If you're civilly committed, they are finding that you are a danger to self or others, or that you're so gravely disabled that you can't take care of yourself. If it's criminal, there's not a finding of dangerous. It's a matter of whether you can aid in your own defense, whether you can discuss the facts of your case with your attorney. Um, I can't quote it verbatim, but basically rationally with a reasonable degree of factual understanding, right? There's no element of dangerousness in there.
Wow.
So you are accused of a crime. You have not been convicted. So there's no final finding that you did anything wrong. And then you're sent to a psychiatric hospital without a finding that you're a danger to anybody. Your initial commitment on a misdemeanor is up to 60 days. You have no right to appeal. On a felony, your initial commitment is 90 days with no right to an appeal. And then, after that, they can go ahead and commit you. And technically, you could be held for, I mean, they have to renew your commitment, but technically, you could be held for as long as what would have been, your maximum sentence had you been convicted of the crime, all without a trial on the merits of your, whether or not you did the crime. So we had a
Again, I want to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, but this commitment is not based on the fact that you were crazy or out of your mental capacities during the commission of the crime. It's whether or not you understand the trial and can aid your attorneys in your defense. Is that what you're
right.
saying?
Yeah, when you read this, the decision it's based on, they're presuming that yeah, you are too out of it to participate. But the part of that decision that our law revolves around has to do with, can you aid in your defense? Can you discuss this with your attorney rationally with a reasonable degree of factual understanding? And uh, with no dangerousness element, it's really questionable as to whether or not we should be holding anybody. Um, I'll give you a great example. We had a case of an attorney who she actually successfully represented a number of people who were being accused of being incompetent, and all of a sudden she gets a criminal charge, and her own attorney decides that she's incompetent. Now, this is a veteran criminal defense attorney, and yes, pretty opinionated on her defense strategy and all that. But that doesn't mean that she wasn't capable of speaking with her attorney. It doesn't mean that she was incompetent in any way. But she got sent to North Texas State Hospital, and then she got sent to Kerrville State Hospital. And how incompetent was she? She was so incompetent that she was allowed to practice law from inside the state hospital.
Wow.
And it took her a year and a half to get out.
See, I didn't know. I didn't know this. I thought that when somebody was deemed mentally incompetent at their trial, it was because of the fact that they were quote unquote crazy at the time that they committed the crime.
No,
This,
no, no. You're confusing not guilty
please,
by reason of insanity
right?
with competency to stand trial. But our,
I'm
our,
sure
our, our
that's a common confusion though.
absolutely, yeah, and not guilty by reason of insanity is another animal. It's not something we've ever liked for this reason. When you're not guilty by reason of insanity, you have this problem of number one, nobody can go back. You're dealing with opinions. Nobody can look into your head and see whether you knew what you were understanding when you committed the crime. And once you are found not guilty by reason of insanity, no, you're not going to prison. No, you're going to be stuck in a psychiatric hospital. And it's really up to the powers that be when you're going to get out. So it's an indeterminate sentence, basically.
Hmm.
But it seems like the person is getting off, but in actual fact, not so much because they're going to be confined. And some people get out, some people spend forever in those places. Um,
As far as the whole mentally incompetent to stand trial portion of this,
hmm
um, you said that they still have to renew the commission, but you could still be there for as long as the maximum sentence of the charge, correct?
Right. So that attorney, now, as it turned out, once she did go through trial, I think she got sentenced to 3 years or something. But technically, had they really pushed, since she hadn't had a trial on the merits of the case, her concern is that she could be facing up to 99 years without ever having a trial on the merits of the crime. Technically, would that have happened? Doubt it. But who knows? When the Statesman was investigating that situation, they actually found a gentleman that had been held as incompetent to stand trial. The law had changed. Before it was just really indeterminate, and then they decided, well, we're going to make it to where you can't be held any longer than your maximum sentence would have been. And so there was a gentleman whose maximum sentence would have been 20 years, and he'd been held for 20 years and 3 months, and they were just trying to decide what to do with him, right? That's a scary proposition. Um,
For
People
sure.
think, you know, we we
Especially, I'm sorry, go ahead.
we call these places hospitals, but if you're confined against your will, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a hospital, a prison, or the Four Seasons. You're still being held against your will.
Yeah. And all of this is still when you are presumed innocent of the crime that you are being charged with because you haven't
Exactly.
been proven guilty, which
Exactly.
is a whole nother violation of due process. It's just a judge says, okay, yeah, he's too mentally incompetent to understand what's going on at this trial, so we're going to we're going to commit him until he is competent. And, that sort of thing. I don't,
And we're going to forcibly drug him and render him competent, but
yeah,
it doesn't matter. You've already been committed for competency restoration. So again, as far as that application to buy a firearm goes, you've been committed.
yeah, for sure.
So,
Uh,
so that's a whole nother population. And, man, we have more and more people who are either being held in the state hospitals for this, or now they're doing jail-based competency restoration. So you have tons of people that are languishing in jail for this quote unquote competency restoration, and that's pretty serious, man.
yeah, for sure. Now, the
So
governor has called for reporting of mental incompetency within 48 hours as opposed to the current 30 days to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS system that we have in place.
yeah,
Uh,
and I don't know enough about that, and I don't know if the current 30 days is because of an appeal period or whether it's just to give judges time to do it. So I don't know how that works.
well, even if
Um,
it is, you don't really have time to build a case for an appeal if they're reporting it within 48 hours, because at that point your right to bear arms is gone.
no, that's my point. Is the current law? I don't know why they put the 30 days there, and who knows? It could have something to do with having an appeal period, but under that proposition, that's a little bit different. And like I say, we are not a gun rights organization, but we are a human rights organization, and I think that that's something that y'all need to be aware of so that you can, decide what your strategy is about that. You probably also need to be aware of the interim charge that was given to the it's a joint charge that was given to the Committee on Homeland Security and Public Safety and the Committee on Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence, and that is to examine current judicial procedures and practices and make recommendations to assist all courts and jurisdictions in reporting judgments and verdicts, which make up the information sent to the National Instant Check System, review and make recommendations regarding the list of convictions, judgments, and judicial orders which disqualify a person from possessing a firearm. I think y'all would want to pay attention to that since we're apparently tampering or contemplating changing the list of things that can disqualify you.
Oh, for sure, especially
You know,
because the current law lists criminal conviction and mental health as two separate line items of that definition of who cannot possess a firearm. And, you know, the criminal conviction is rather specific,
uh
whereas
huh.
mental health is incredibly broad. As you know, we're here at the 40-minute mark of this conversation, and I don't even feel like we've really gotten too terribly deep into this. I mean, I feel like this conversation could literally go for hours before
Yeah,
we
and
have.
it's one of those things that people need to actually know and reflect on because again, in some ways it seems complex. In other ways, it's actually incredibly simple. It's just that it's so far-reaching, right?
Basically, you
Essentially,
can't have a.
you're
Good.
calling somebody a name, and based on that, their rights and liberties are going to be affected. Mostly what I deal with is people's right to go home,
Right.
right, and people's right to make informed decisions as to what do they say you have. What are the benefits of the purported benefits of the treatment? What are the risks? And really, what are the alternatives, including no treatment at all? Right?
Yeah.
And the corollary of informed consent is informed refusal. And you have a right to refuse. And those are rights that we deal with on a daily basis. You're seeing them because these same allegations of mental illness, these same issues impact Second Amendment rights. So on the one hand, you've got the commitment issue, but then on the other hand, you also have the license to carry issue because when you fill out that application, you're going to have to answer a number of questions, including, whether you've been treated for bipolar disorder, whether you've been treated with certain drugs. I
Y-
believe it's been a long time since I looked at the form. But the point is, okay, let's say you do get locked up. Let's say you agree to take the drugs just to get out. Great. You've gone home. You've quit taking the drugs. You've gone back to your normal life. A couple of years go by. You're doing well. You have a firearm, and you go, man, I would like to exercise my rights. I would like to do the class and apply for my LTC. Well, what do? You're either going to lie on the form and break the law, or you're going to
Tell
tell
the
the
truth.
truth on the form and get denied, or you're going to tell the truth on the form and then have to go find a doctor that will give you a clean bill of health, and then there's going to have to go before a review board. So even that, even having gone into treatment can affect your LTC rights, and that's the point. Like I say, we're not a gun rights organization, but what we're saying is people actually need, people who do care about their gun rights actually need to know the ramifications of these things.
So let me
But
ask
these,
you
uh huh,
on as it relates to your organization and
uh huh.
your focus. What sorts of issues do you have with this whole red flag proposal that the governor has?
I think it's a bigger issue, and I tried to bring it up at the beginning, and that's this: we've got this whole narrative around mental illness, and so we've thrown this blanket statement, that basically says the mentally ill are dangerous. And number one, we feel like they're kind of the straw man in the gun debate because we're pointing to a population. We're saying, "Oh, dangerous," when the fact is that the majority of that population is no more dangerous than anybody else, and they've committed no crime.
Yeah,
And the process of this is it's every bit as tough as the commitment process. And not only that, but in a situation following one of these shootings, now you've got this heightened awareness. You have people wanting to act out of quote unquote an abundance of caution, and so it's going to impact people's rights. I'm still trying to decide, are we going to testify? How do we testify? Because again, we don't take a position on gun rights,
right,
right? We take a position on the right of people to be at liberty and decide what treatments are what they want to do. We not be forced into treatment when they've committed no crime. Those are the types of things that we deal with. And but again, it's funny. Just as this mental health thing impacts Second Amendment rights, this Second Amendment argument also, it goes both ways, is what I'm saying.
right. And not to
And
mention, beyond the gun rights, that I mean, these proposals are tailored specifically to target gun rights. But
mhm.
I mean, there are still going to be other ramifications outside of gun rights that are going to be impacted as soon as this red flag proposal, if it goes into effect. Because really, all it takes is a few people at a school to say, "Yeah, I think something's wrong with Timmy over there."
Well, that's the thing. There is obviously, you've got the red flag issue in the governor's recommendations. You've got several of those types of issues, but you have a huge amount of content in his recommendations that really involves mental health screening of children, predicting who's going to be violent, and pushing a program out of Lubbock that basically you've got kids that have been identified one way or another as a risk. They get mental health screened. Um, to about half of those going through some sort of interview style triage, and then you look at the stats. Okay, 7 arrests the first year. Um, 25 children removed from school. 44 children sent to alternative education placements. Well, great. Good luck getting into college. Okay. 38 children taken to emergency rooms or inpatient hospitals. This is a huge impact, and the effects of that, no doubt, will follow these children for the rest of their lives. I mean, imagine the trauma of being marched out of school in handcuffs,
Yeah.
right? And there were kids who were detained at school.
I mean, it doesn't take much to look into issues like this. I mean, hell, Kyle Kushev at Parkland was
Hmm.
detained by law enforcement just because he went to the gun range with his dad and posted a video on Twitter. You know,
Wow.
uh,
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw an article last night that talked about the increase in mental health detentions in the wake of the Parkland shooting, and apparently, some clinics in Florida saw their admissions as much as or referrals as much as triple.
mhm.
You had people running, and that's hysteria.
Oh, for sure. And
It's hysteria.
really, what
Um,
everything boils down to is that very, very, very few people, even those with mental illness, are violent. Very, very, very
right.
few people will think that it's a good idea and act on it to hurt somebody else or infringe on their liberties. You know,
That's exactly right.
but
And
we
and
have this.
conversely, you could look at the drug side effects aspect of this, and when you go down the list of shooters, it's amazing how many were on or coming off of psychiatric drugs.
Yeah,
Does that mean you have to take the gun rights away from everybody who does a drug? No, but you do have to train teachers and other people to recognize side effects that have violence potential, because you've got to communicate that to parents, because then they can talk to their doctor
yeah. I
and
mean,
they can decide to do what to do. That way, guess what? The government's not deciding what you're going to do. They're saying, hey, you need to know this, because let's face it, parents have a duty and they have a God-given right to deal with their children, and that's not the government's right, it's the parents' right.
yeah. I mean,
The proper thing is to train and to communicate concerns to parents.
yeah, under this new proposal, I mean, I don't think that they have to really be informed until, it's at the point where, hey, we're committing your son, or we're
Um,
sending him for evaluation. Is it?
there is parental consent in a couple of different ways. The question is whether or not it is informed consent. The kids who were interviewed in Lubbock that ended up being arrested, were they told that things they revealed during their interview could result in their arrest? Were their parents told that? Were they or their parents told that the things that they say could result in institutionalization? Were they told that things they divulged could uh, result in CPS involvement? And I'm not saying that people who commit crimes shouldn't be arrested, but I'm saying before you're questioned, you ought to know your rights.
Absolutely.
It's ironic. We have a law that allows the police to detain you for mental health reasons without a warrant.
How can they make
And
that determination?
basically, they're just deciding, hey, is this guy a danger to self or others? And if so, what do I do with him? And the police are in just as good a position to make that decision as psychiatrists are. Psychiatrists don't are no better at predicting future dangerousness than anybody else. And I'm not saying that the police get it right. I'm not even saying that it's right that we have this. But what I am saying is, you have this system where it's done. We're seeing an exploding number of these warrantless mental health detentions in places where they're reporting any data. There is no statewide system. But part of our law is this: if they do that and they take you to a psych hospital, you have to be assessed by a mental health professional within 12 hours. But ironically, you don't have to be informed that what you say to that mental health professional can be used against you in a commitment hearing for 24 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have to be seen within 12. You don't have to be warned for 24. And then once you are in there, you languish.
Yeah.
If you were a criminal defendant who got taken to jail You would have to be brought in front of a magistrate to be warned as soon as possible, not to exceed 48 hours. If you are a mental health patient, um, they have to make up their mind about, what to do with you and get that information to a judge within 48 hours, not counting weekends and holidays. So basically, in the criminal system, due process is swift.
Hmm.
In the mental health system, due process doesn't work on weekends and holidays.
Right. And not to mention, whenever somebody is placed under arrest, the first thing that they're told is you have the right to remain silent, and their entire Miranda rights are read to them, including that anything that you do say can be held against you in court.
That's correct.
But
Um,
whenever it comes to mental health issues, somebody could be going through something, uh, but it doesn't require them to be institutionalized or even forced onto psychotropic drugs or drugs of any kind. It could just be having a therapist to talk to, but
Having support, it's amazing because in doing this work, you run into people in the community that are helping people, and you run into a lot of people that don't want to diagnose. They don't want to start people down that road. They just want to help, and some of those people are doing an incredible job. And I'm not saying that people don't have problems, and I'm not saying that some people aren't dangerous because some people are. But if you haven't committed a crime, I'm not sure about locking you up. And if we're gonna do this to people, we've got to protect their rights very carefully because what happens, unfortunately, just like in the criminal system, what happens to you in the mental health system could impact your rights for the rest of your life.
yeah, Jefferson said it best. Of course, he wrote it in Latin, but he said, "I prefer dangerous liberty to peaceful servitude."
I like
And
that.
uh, it's really true because I mean, what you're describing, it is tyranny. It is, uh, somebody having to prove before, without the commission of a crime at all, that they are okay to exercise their liberties because of some issue they may or may not even be going through. It could just be reported by somebody who is being spiteful, and we're supposed to have a system of justice, and that includes in the mental health world, where you are presumed innocent until you are proven guilty, and you should be presumed competent until you can be proven mentally incompetent, and that should come with its own set of circumstances and stipulations, uh, that don't infringe upon your liberties. And
Right, and in the process, we're making judges, or we're asking judges, and we're asking mental health people. We're asking people to make decisions or predictions that none of us are adequately qualified to make.
right.
That a layperson is in just as good a position to predict dangerousness as a mental health person.
Hmm.
And the fact is, none of us know. It's interesting. There was a study done. There's this. I think they're called Texas Defender Service, and they do a lot of death penalty appeals. And because to get the death penalty, you got to have some psychiatrist come in and predict that you're going to be dangerous in the future. They did this study and they looked at death row inmates and how many of them engaged in dangerous behavior after their conviction, right? And God, it's been a while since I looked at it, but I think it was like 95% of those guys didn't ever do anything dangerous. Yet 100% of them it had been predicted that they would, and that was part of them getting the death penalty.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well,
so it's that tenuous, right? We're working off of opinions, and since we're doing quotes, I'll give you a quote from the Supreme Court. And this was in a case called O'Connor versus Donaldson. It's kind of one of the landmark mental health cases on what does it take to commit somebody, and you know the question really was, can you can you commit somebody just for room and board, or does do you have to be doing something that could reasonably be calculated to make them better or whatever, right? But this is what the court said: may the state fence in the harmless mentally ill solely to save its citizens from exposure to those whose ways are different. One might as well ask if the state, to avoid public unease, could incarcerate all who are physically unattractive or socially eccentric. Mere public intolerance or animosity cannot constitutionally justify the deprivation of a person's personal liberty.
That is very profound. I'm not. I I've said it uh, more than a few times, but the liberty that needs the most protection is the liberty that is agreed with the least. And because if everybody's agreeing, then there's not an issue. But if you have 99% of a community wanting to seize Billy Bob's property to build a community center, and Billy Bob is the only dissenting vote, well, his vote should be the one that matters because it's his rights being trampled on.
Exactly. Yeah, our joke about it is laws aren't made for beautiful people because they're already protected.
Right.
You know, and and that's the real shame of mental illness even being brought into the gun debate is that it's a straw man, and you can point, or a red herring, or whatever you want to call it, but you can point to this population and equate gun crime with them, and it's easy for people to go, oh man, they can't take care of themselves. I'm sorry, we have tens of millions of people in this country who have labels and who are taking care of themselves every day.
And you know something, I don't give any credit to the current gun control laws on the books for this, but you never hear a story about a schizophrenic going up and shooting a populated area.
Well, that's an interesting point, and I actually I don't. A surprising number of shooters had been in mental health treatment, and I really haven't followed what their diagnoses were. But that begs the question of, well, wait a minute, the guy was already in treatment. What are you going to do? Treat him twice?
Yeah.
And so it becomes a question of, well, gosh, what are we doing here? We're saying that, oh gosh, we need to be able to force people into treatment. Or, oh, look, he was off his meds. Well, gosh, what about the meds made that a problem?
That's
What made that a problem, right?
yeah,
People, we really believe, the most fundamental thing we believe in is informed consent,
of course.
making informed choices. We're not here to tell you you should do something. We're not here to tell you you shouldn't do something. We're here to tell you you have the right to be informed and make your own decisions. And that's the problem with mental health in the gun debate is we're basically saying, well, guys, you got this label here, and we're not so sure that you should be able to make your own decision.
Yeah. If Lee, I we've gone long here, but I'll tell you this conversation needs to happen more often. People need to know exactly what it means to tout this talking point around and what that means for our liberties as a whole. And I really appreciate your time today. If people want to find out more about the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, where can they go?
The easiest place to go is cchrint.org.
That's INT.
Yes, cchrint.org. And yeah, and frankly, I wish that that mental health was not part of the Second Amendment debate. I think that you know, our Amendment rights worth debating, absolutely, just as all things are worth debating. But I think when we start putting false mental illness into this, we start getting into a false narrative and an image that people are already having a hard time overcoming.
Mm-hmm.
And day to day among just people, people tend to tolerate other people, in general. But where you see it, as a problem is official contact, going to the doctor, or ending up dealing with the police or at the Capitol. And then you see people say the most incredible things based on just a mental health label.
Yeah.
And
No,
it's called stigma, right? And
it
it's
is.
funny because the people behind this whole anti stigma campaign are some of the same people that push these red flag type laws. And going, really? Wow. Nothing says stigma like, hey, we want to take away your rights because you have this label. But
I would say that it's ironic, but it's at this point in uh, our history, I'm gonna say that it's not. It's more expected than anything else.
it's
Unfortunately,
1984, man. It's double speak.
I know. I need to go back and
And
read that book again
I did
because.
last year because there were so many odd bills at the Capitol that were snoopy. The word Orwellian has just kind of, it's been over years, but, one of my testimonies, I pointed out, up until now, I thought 1984 was a novel. Now I realize it was a manual.
Yep.
Um, and unfortunately, that seems like where we're getting to in our society.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think you're right. Lee, thank you very much for your time and shedding at least some light on this. I know this is an issue that we could talk about for a very long period of time before we really fully understand uh, what's going on with it as it relates to our liberties. But I
Hey,
think,
thanks. Yeah, and I really appreciate the opportunity because, in general, I talk to too many people in the Second Amendment crowd that believe in their cause, but then, when it comes to mental health, like we were saying, everything gets fuzzy, right?
mhm,
And it was just important to me that y'all be able to really think clearly and make good decisions about this because, you deserve to know.
yeah, for sure. Well, I really appreciate the time. And if you ever want to come back on, you have an open invitation, okay?
Hey, thanks, Derek. And yeah, I really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, guys. That was a lot to take in. I am going to definitely go back and re-listen to this conversation because I know that even having this, being part of this conversation, that I missed something. So I would recommend the same to you. Go back and re-listen to this and share it with everybody that you know, because when we talk mental health, it is a very dangerous topic, especially as it relates to our liberties, not just our gun rights, but liberties for everything else. So I would encourage you to go back and just re-listen to this conversation whenever you get a chance, and please share it with everybody that you know. And please make sure that you are subscribed if you are not already, and rate us on iTunes and Google Play. And until next Sunday, Lone Star Gunners, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo. Lone Star Gun Talk is a Lone Star Gun Rights production, hosted and edited by Derek Wills. Copyright Lone Star Gun Rights 2018.